At first, the connections seem like coincidence or curious similarities, but the deeper you journey into the ancient stories, the harder it is to dismiss how stories attributed to Homer have direct influence on both the Old and New Testament stories. What begins as a few familiar echoes soon unfolds into a remarkable pattern. Again and again, the symbolic framework of the Odyssey and other archaic Greek traditions appear throughout both ancient Israel and early Christianity. Heroes are tested by impossible trials. Divine beings intervene to alter human destiny. Dangerous journeys become paths of transformation. And ordinary individuals are called to missions that will change the course of history. The pattern and symbolic repetition is so striking that it invites a deeper question. What if Bronze Age myths, oral storytelling, and shared ancient symbols were actually the inspiration and influence on the stories of monotheistic religions? The real mystery and inspiration comes from exploring how much the stories reveal about the shared world that gave birth to ancient civilizations. For thousands of years, stories traveled with merchants, sailors, refugees, and empires. They crossed seas, changed languages, and evolved with every generation. Heroes became kings. Goddesses became symbols. Ancient myths were reshaped into new religious traditions, preserving fragments of an even older past. These myths are more than entertaining legends. They are clues, fragments of a much larger story stretching back long before Greece, long before the Bible, and into the earliest civilizations of the ancient world. This journey follows those forgotten threads. Who were the storytellers behind these enduring traditions? What inspired them? And what ancient world were they trying to remember through stories that still shape our understanding of history, religion, and ourselves today? Let's review some of our written history while understanding that oral, written and translated dates matter in this bigger story. Long before the stories of Homer, Moses, or the great epics of the classical world, one of humanity's earliest surviving heroic narratives was already being told. The Epic of Gilgamesh evolved over more than 1,500 years, passed down, expanded, and reshaped by generations of cuneiform scribes and storytellers. The earliest versions began as a collection of independent Sumerian poems around 2100 BCE, centered on Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, who may have been inspired by a historical ruler from the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia. Over time, these separate tales were combined into a larger narrative written in Akkadian. By around 1800 BCE, the Old Babylonian version represented one of the first attempts to create a unified epic, with fragments of this early composition surviving on ancient clay tablets. The story continued to develop for centuries until it reached its most complete form, around 1300 to 1000 BCE. This version, traditionally associated with the scholar and scribe Sin-Leki Unini, expanded the epic into 12 tablets and created the version that would become the foundation for modern translations. For thousands of years, however, the Epic of Gilgamesh disappeared from human memory. The cuneiform writing system of ancient Mesopotamia was eventually lost, and the clay tablets containing these stories were buried beneath the ruins of forgotten cities. It was not until the 19th century, when archaeologists excavated the Royal Library of Nineveh, that the epic was rediscovered. Among the thousands of tablets uncovered were fragments of Gilgamesh's journey, revealing one of the oldest surviving stories ever written and reconnecting the modern world with the myths, fears, and questions of ancient humanity. 1400 years later, humans have been traveling and so have their stories. Traditionally attributed to the blind Greek poet Homer, the Iliad would be set around 1200 BCE during the Late Bronze Age. For generations, the epic was passed down through an oral tradition, performed by traveling bards who relied on memory, rhythm, and repeated poetic phrases to preserve the tale. Because the original manuscripts have long since disappeared, scholars continue to debate exactly when the poem was first written down. Most historians believe the oral tradition was transcribed into the earliest forms of the Greek alphabet between about 725 and 675 BCE. In the 6th century BCE, during the rule of Pisistratos in Athens, the poem was likely standardized into a more consistent written version. The oldest surviving manuscript fragments, however, date only to the 3rd century BCE, when copies of the Odyssey were produced in Ptolemaic Egypt, reminding us that every version we read today is the product of a long journey through history. The timeline of the Bible places its earliest Greek translations well after the Homeric epics had already been composed and widely circulated throughout the Mediterranean. The Septuagint, the Greek translation that became the foundation of the Old Testament, began in Alexandria, Egypt, when the first 5 books of Moses were translated around 280 to 250 BCE. The remaining books were completed over the following centuries, with the collection largely finished by about 132 BCE. By that time, the Iliad and the Odyssey had already been transmitted for centuries through oral performance and written copies, becoming some of the most influential works in the ancient world. The books of the New Testament were written even later in the 1st century CE, with Mark written around 65-70 CE, Matthew and Luke around 80-85 CE, and John between 90 and 100 CE. This reflects the prevailing academic view that the Gospels were composed after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE, although some conservative scholars argue for earlier dates, placing Mark in the late 40s or 50s CE and Matthew and Luke in the decades that followed. Regardless of which dating is preferred, both the Greek Old Testament and the New Testament were produced centuries after Homer's epics had become foundational works of Greek culture. It is therefore reasonable to conclude that many Jewish and early Christian writers were well acquainted with these stories and the framework. And real-world trade networks, or the ancient working class, lived in a world where borders were fluid and where the heroic stories, symbolic themes, and literary musicality of Homer were already deeply embedded in the cultural landscape. At first glance, Odysseus, Jesus and Moses seem to have little in common. But let's compare their stories, to find that a series of striking symbolic parallels begins to emerge. Let's start with comparing Odysseus to the stories of Jesus. Both heroes journey into the realm of the dead before returning to the world of the living. In the Odyssey, Odysseus descends into the underworld to seek the wisdom of the blind prophet Tiresias, whose guidance will help him complete his journey home. Jesus also descends to the realm of the dead after his crucifixion, before rising again on the third day, overcoming death itself. Both men also return to their own people without being recognized. After 20 years away, Odysseus arrives in Ithaca disguised as a poor beggar. He walks among his own household unnoticed, revealing his true identity only when the time is right. Likewise, following the resurrection, Jesus appears to his disciples in ways they do not immediately understand. Mary Magdalene mistakes him for a gardener, and the disciples on the road to Emmaus walk beside him without realizing who he is until later. Recognition, in both stories, comes only after a test. Odysseus conceals his identity to discover who has remained loyal during his long absence, separating faithful friends from traitors before reclaiming his kingdom. Jesus also tests the faith of his followers, challenging them to believe even when they cannot yet fully understand what they have witnessed. Both stories use delayed recognition to reveal the true character of those who follow the hero. The sea plays a symbolic role in both traditions. Odysseus spends much of his epic battling the unpredictable forces of the ocean, surviving storms through intelligence, endurance, and, at times, divine assistance. In the Gospels, Jesus demonstrates authority over the sea itself, calming a violent storm with a command and revealing his power over the forces of chaos. Because the Odyssey was composed centuries before the Gospels, scholars have asserted that the authors of the New Testament drew from familiar Homeric story patterns when presenting the life of Jesus to Greek-speaking audiences. According to this view, echoes of Homer's epic could have helped communicate the significance of Jesus within the framework already shaped by Greek literature. Many scholars view the similarities as examples of common literary motifs that appear across many ancient traditions rather than evidence of direct borrowing, but there are too many similarities for it to just be about motifs. Now let's compare the Greek epic with the Old Testament and the ancient Hebrew tradition. For Odysseus, the goal is simple: return home to the island kingdom of Ithaca. Yet what should have been a short voyage becomes a decade-long struggle against raging seas, terrifying monsters, and the relentless anger of the gods before he can finally reclaim his throne. Moses' journey is even more ambitious. Rather than leading himself home, he guides an entire nation through the wilderness for 40 years, transforming a scattered group of former slaves into a people united by a shared covenant, identity, and purpose. In both epics, the destination is only part of the story. The true transformation happens along the way. Every trial becomes a lesson, every setback forges resilience, and every impossible challenge shapes the leader. By the time their journeys end, neither Odysseus nor Moses is the same person who first set out. This version builds more suspense by contrasting the destinations first, revealing the deeper theme, that the journey, not the destination, transforms both leaders that defines them. Both are also portrayed as instruments of divine purpose, and like Dorothy in Oz, they are fixated on the idea of finding home. Neither Odysseus nor Moses completes his journey through human strength alone. Throughout the Odyssey, Athena watches over Odysseus, in ways that border from maternal to romantic. The goddess of wisdom guides him, disguises him when danger closes in, and intervenes at pivotal moments to navigate on course to his destiny. Moses, by contrast, is called directly by Yahweh through the burning bush and is empowered by miraculous signs that lead Israel out of Egypt. As the nation travels through the wilderness, God's presence remains constant, appearing as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to guide the people forward. In both stories, the heroes must face impossible trials and make difficult choices, but they never walk the path alone. A divine presence accompanies them, directing their journey and shaping the outcome of their mission. The greatest obstacles in both stories come from confronting powers that seem impossible to overcome. Moses must stand before Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the ancient Near East, and demand the release of an enslaved nation despite overwhelming odds. Odysseus faces a different kind of adversary with Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose relentless wrath transforms every voyage into a battle for survival. Whether opposing an earthly king or a divine force, each hero spends years struggling against an authority far greater than himself. That long conflict becomes the driving force behind the entire journey. And when we look even closer, another intriguing parallel begins to emerge. The main striking parallel is the way both heroes are separated from the lives that should have been theirs. Moses is born a Hebrew but raised as a prince in Pharaoh's palace, growing up between two identities and fully belonging to neither until he embraces his role as the leader of Israel. Odysseus begins as the rightful king of Ithaca, yet decades of war and wandering leave him a stranger to his own homeland. When he finally returns, he cannot reveal himself immediately but must disguise himself as a beggar before reclaiming the throne that has always been his. In both stories, the hero must first lose his place in the world before he can truly discover who he is, and reclaim the identity that was always waiting for him. Exile becomes the proving ground for both heroes, but each is shaped by a very different mysterious geography. Moses spends 40 years in Midian after fleeing Egypt, transforming from a hunted fugitive into a seasoned shepherd and desert survivor. Living among the Midianites gives Moses an intimate knowledge of the harsh wilderness, forges important family alliances, and prepares him with the practical skills needed to lead an entire nation through the Sinai toward the Promised Land. Odysseus, by contrast, is tested not by the predictable rhythms of the desert but by the ever-changing dangers of the Mediterranean Sea. His long voyage demands constant adaptability as he confronts storms, monsters, hostile shores, and the whims of the gods. One hero masters the land, the other the sea, yet both are ultimately shaped by years of hardship far from home. And throughout their journeys, neither succeeds by skill alone. Divine guidance repeatedly intervenes, directing their path and preparing them to fulfill their roles as the leader and hero their people need. The final destination of each journey reveals one of the greatest differences between these two heroes. Moses devotes his life to leading Israel toward the Promised Land, yet he never sets foot in it himself. His legacy is not one of personal reward but of preparing the next generation to inherit the future. Odysseus, on the other hand, is driven by a deeply personal mission. He longs to return to Ithaca, reunite with his wife and son, and reclaim the kingdom that has always been his. Yet both stories ultimately look beyond the individual hero. Moses establishes the foundation of a nation, while Odysseus secures the royal lineage that will continue the house of Ithaca. In both traditions, the hero's journey becomes part of a larger story about inheritance, identity, and the future of a people. Despite their different destinations, the narrative arc remains remarkably similar. Each man begins his journey untested and is transformed through exile, suffering, divine guidance, and relentless perseverance. By the end, both have become leaders whose lives define the identity of their civilizations. Whether encountered in the pages of the Old Testament or in the verses of Homer, these enduring epics remind us that the true purpose of the journey is not simply to arrive at a destination. It is to become the person capable of fulfilling the destiny that awaits there. Neither hero is presented as perfect. In fact, both stories go out of their way to expose their weaknesses. They are deeply flawed, profoundly human figures who carry the crushing burden of leadership while struggling with their own failures and the failures of those they are called to lead. That may be one of the reasons their stories have endured for thousands of years. Unlike legendary heroes who seem larger than life, Odysseus and Moses are remarkably relatable. They doubt themselves. They lose their temper. They make costly mistakes. And despite their best efforts, they watch the people entrusted to them repeatedly undermine everything they have worked to accomplish. Odysseus' greatest weakness is his pride. Again and again, his intelligence saves him from impossible situations. But just as often, his own ego threatens to destroy him. The clearest example comes after he blinds the Cyclops Polyphemus. Safe aboard his ship, Odysseus cannot resist boasting about his victory. Instead of sailing away in silence, he shouts his real name back to the blinded giant, craving recognition for his cleverness. That single moment of pride gives Polyphemus the opportunity to call upon his father, Poseidon, whose anger condemns Odysseus to another decade of wandering across the sea. His greatest enemy is often himself. Moses struggles with different flaws, but they are no less human. Long before leading Israel, Moses kills an Egyptian overseer in a burst of anger after witnessing the abuse of a Hebrew slave. Later, when God calls him at the burning bush, Moses repeatedly protests that he is unfit for the task. He doubts his own abilities, points to his difficulty speaking, and begs God to send someone else in his place. Despite being remembered as one of the greatest prophets and leaders in history, Moses is not portrayed in the biblical narrative as a flawless hero. Instead, he is presented as a deeply complex figure, a man chosen for an extraordinary mission, yet constantly struggling with his own weaknesses. His story is not simply about miracles and triumphs. It is also a story of anger, insecurity, frustration, and moments of failure. In many ways, Moses becomes a powerful example of how great leaders can carry both remarkable strengths and profound human flaws. One of Moses' greatest struggles was his temper. Throughout his life, anger repeatedly shaped his actions. As a young man in Egypt, he allowed his rage to take control when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. Rather than using his position or influence to seek justice, Moses reacted violently and killed the man, forcing him to flee Egypt. Years later, after descending from Mount Sinai and witnessing the Israelites worshipping the golden calf, his anger erupted again. In a moment of fury, he smashed the stone tablets containing the 10 Commandments. Following this event, his command for the Levites to punish those involved resulted in the deaths of thousands of Israelites. Moses' anger often came from a desire to defend what he believed was right, but his inability to control that emotion repeatedly brought devastating consequences. Yet Moses' greatest weakness was not only his anger, it was also his lack of confidence in himself. When God called him at the burning bush, Moses did not respond with immediate courage. Instead, he questioned whether he was capable of leading anyone. He argued that he was not an eloquent speaker and described himself as slow of speech and tongue. Rather than accepting the mission, he repeatedly asked God to choose someone else. His hesitation reveals a leader who was not driven by ambition but by insecurity, feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility placed upon him. God eventually appointed Aaron as his spokesperson, acknowledging Moses' struggle with self-doubt. The most consequential failure in Moses' life came at Meribah. After years of leading a frustrated and rebellious people through the wilderness, Moses reached a breaking point. When the Israelites demanded water, God instructed him to speak to a rock so that water would flow. Instead, overwhelmed by anger, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff and declared, "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" In that moment, his frustration caused him to shift attention away from God and toward himself. Because he failed to demonstrate God's holiness before the people, Moses was denied entry into the Promised Land, the very destination he had spent 40 years pursuing. When compared with Odysseus, however, the flaws of these two legendary figures move in opposite directions. Moses' downfall is often connected to uncontrolled emotion, while Odysseus' greatest weakness is uncontrolled pride. Moses struggled with anger that erupted in moments of intense pressure. Odysseus, meanwhile, was undone by his own confidence in his intelligence and abilities. His greatest gift, his cunning, or metus, was also his greatest danger. The encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus reveals this contrast perfectly. Odysseus and his men could have escaped after blinding the monster, but Odysseus' pride compelled him to reveal his true identity from the safety of his ship. By shouting his name to Polyphemus, he transformed a successful escape into a personal insult against Poseidon's son, bringing the god's wrath down upon his journey home. His intelligence saved him, but his ego endangered everyone around him. Moses and Odysseus also differ in how their flaws affect those they lead. Moses' failures often come from carrying too much responsibility. His anger at Meribah emerges after decades of sacrifice and exhaustion, while trying to guide a difficult population through the wilderness. His mistake exhibits a moment of human weakness in a life largely defined by service. Odysseus, however, often places his own desires above the safety of his crew. He remains in the Cyclops cave despite the risks. He devises a plan to be able to listen to the songs of the sirens for his own curiosity. He repeatedly allows his pursuit of glory, exploration, and knowledge to endanger the men under his command. Even their punishments reflect these differences. Moses' punishment is spiritual and symbolic. His one action failed to properly revere and reveal God's power and holiness. In the end of Moses' Odyssey, the prophet is not allowed to enter the promised land. Odysseus' punishment is physical and personal. After offending Poseidon, he loses his ships, his companions, and nearly everything connected to his former identity, forced to endure years of suffering before returning to Ithaca disguised as a powerless beggar. Moses must learn humility, patience, and trust. Odysseus must learn restraint, wisdom, and the limits of his own pride. Their stories reveal two very different kinds of heroes, one burdened by the weight of responsibility, the other challenged by the danger of believing he can overcome anything. In both traditions, greatness does not come from being flawless. It comes from surviving the journey and becoming worthy of the role they were chosen to fulfill. Neither man's greatest challenge comes from enemies. Their most complicated challenges can come from the people they lead. Throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus' crew repeatedly ignores his warnings. When the wind god Aeolus entrusts Odysseus with a bag containing the dangerous winds, his sailors greedily assume it holds treasure. While Odysseus sleeps, they open it, destroying months of progress by blowing the fleet back across the sea. Moses faces an almost identical struggle with the burden of leadership. Early in his journey, he attempted to personally handle every dispute and complaint brought before him by the Israelites. From morning until night, he carried the responsibility of judging every problem among the people. His father-in-law Jethro recognized that this approach would destroy both Moses and the nation he was trying to lead. Jethro taught him the importance of delegation and shared authority. Even Moses' greatest strength, his devotion to his people, could become a weakness when he tried to carry the entire burden alone. One of the most striking parallels between the story of Moses and the journey of Odysseus is that the greatest crisis occurs when the central leader is no longer present. In both narratives, the absence of the hero creates a moment of chaos where those left behind lose their discipline and abandon the path they were meant to follow. When Moses ascends Mount Sinai for 40 days to commune with God, the Israelites are left waiting in the wilderness without their leader. In his absence, Aaron, the very person chosen to help guide them, succumbs to the pressure of the crowd. Rather than maintaining their faith, Aaron collects their gold and fashions the golden calf, creating an idol that allows the people to replace an unseen god with something they can physically worship. A similar breakdown occurs during Odysseus' journey home. After his crew becomes trapped on the island of the sun god Helios, Odysseus leaves them temporarily to pray for divine assistance while the gods place him into a deep sleep. Without his leadership, his second-in-command, Eurylochus, takes control and convinces the starving crew to break the sacred command of the gods. Faced with hunger and desperation, they choose immediate survival over obedience, slaughtering the cattle of Helios despite knowing the consequences. The motivations behind these two acts of disobedience reveal a fascinating contrast between the two traditions. The failure of the Israelites is a spiritual crisis. They are overcome by fear and uncertainty. Unable to accept a god they cannot see and a leader who has disappeared, they return to the familiar religious practices of Egypt and create a physical representation of divine power. Odysseus' crew faces a different kind of temptation. Their failure is driven by physical desperation. They are stranded, their supplies are gone, and hunger begins to overpower their judgment. They understand that eating the cattle is forbidden, but the immediate need for survival becomes stronger than their ability to consider future consequences. Interestingly, both groups attempt to justify their actions by creating their own version of compromise. The Israelites claim that the golden calf represents the very gods who delivered them from Egypt, attempting to merge their former beliefs with their new covenant. Likewise, Odysseus' crew convinces themselves that their crime can be forgiven later, promising that once they return safely to Ithaca, they will build a magnificent temple to Helios as compensation for the cattle they consumed. In both stories, however, the divine response is immediate and severe because a sacred boundary has been crossed. When Yahweh sees the Israelites worshipping the golden calf, his anger burns so fiercely that he threatens to destroy the entire nation. Only Moses' intervention prevents total destruction. The punishment that follows is severe. The idol is destroyed and ground into dust, the people are forced to drink the mixture, and those responsible face violent judgment. Ultimately, the generation that rebelled is condemned to wander the wilderness for 40 years before reaching the promised land. The punishment of Odysseus' crew follows a similar pattern of divine retribution. When Helios discovers that his sacred cattle have been slaughtered, he demands justice from Zeus, warning that he will withdraw the sun itself if the offense is ignored. Zeus waits until the crew leaves the island before striking their ship with a devastating thunderbolt. Every member of Odysseus' crew is killed, leaving him as the sole survivor, a broken hero stripped of his ship, his companions, and his identity as a commander. Through these two stories, the ancient writers explore a shared theme. When leadership disappears, human beings are vulnerable to fear, temptation, and self-justification to be selfish. Whether the failure comes from spiritual doubt or physical desperation, both narratives suggest that abandoning a sacred order carries consequences that reshape the entire journey. For Moses, as for Odysseus, the greatest obstacle is not the wilderness. It is human nature. Both leaders spend their lives trying to guide followers who repeatedly choose fear, impatience, and immediate gratification over trust, teamwork, and obedience. It did not help that the Israelites repeatedly question his leadership. They complain about hunger. They complain about thirst. They long to return to Egypt even after witnessing miraculous deliverance. Then, while Moses receives the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, the people lose patience entirely. They melt down their gold, fashion a golden calf, and begin worshipping it, breaking the covenant they had only recently accepted. Odysseus ultimately returns to Ithaca completely alone. Every companion who left Troy with him dies along the journey. His greatest success, finding his way home, is overshadowed by his inability to save the men under his command. Moses experiences a different but equally tragic suffering and punishment. After decades of leading Israel through the wilderness, he reaches the edge of the promised land. Yet in a final moment of frustration, he strikes the rock at Meribah instead of speaking to it as God commanded. And because of that act of disobedience, he is forbidden from entering the land of Israel himself. He climbs Mount Nebo, looks across the Jordan at the destination he has spent 40 years pursuing, and dies without ever setting foot inside it. Both stories remind us that even the greatest leaders cannot escape the consequences of their own actions. But perhaps the most powerful parallel is the loneliness of leadership itself. Odysseus spends years isolated from everything and everyone he loves. He is stranded on distant islands, separated from his wife, his son, and his kingdom. Time and again, Homer describes him sitting alone on the shore, staring across the sea and weeping for home. Moses experiences a different kind of isolation. He stands between an impatient nation and an angry God, pleading for mercy on behalf of people who constantly complain or protest against him. The Israelites blame him whenever hardship arises, while Moses continually intercedes to prevent their destruction. He belongs neither fully with the people nor fully apart from them. Leadership leaves him profoundly alone and his God exiles him. Moses and Odysseus would not be the typical image of what a hero would embody. They stumble. They question themselves. They fail. They bear responsibilities that would overwhelm most people, and they continue moving forward despite exhaustion, disappointment, and loss. In that sense, their stories are not simply adventures about reaching a destination. They are meditations on the cost of leadership itself, and on the lonely burden carried by those who are called to lead others through an uncertain world. Disguises and concealed identity are essential to both the Odyssey and the story of Moses, but each hero uses them in profoundly different ways. Odysseus survives through carefully crafted deception, changing his appearance to outwit enemies and reclaim his kingdom. Moses, by contrast, struggles with an evolving sense of self, moving between cultures and identities until he ultimately embraces the role God has chosen for him. Odysseus is the literal master of disguise. Throughout the Odyssey, he relies on physical deception as one of his greatest weapons. His most famous transformation comes when he finally returns to Ithaca. Disguised by Athena as an aged, filthy beggar, he slips unnoticed into his own palace. Hidden in plain sight, he is able to test the loyalty of servants and family, gather intelligence on the suitors occupying his home, and prepare the perfect moment to reclaim his throne. His disguise is not an escape from his identity, it is a strategy that allows him to fulfill it. Moses' disguises are far less deliberate, but no less significant. Rather than changing his outward appearance by choice, he lives between cultures. Born a Hebrew slave, he is raised as an Egyptian prince, adopting the language, customs, and status of the royal court. Later, after fleeing Egypt, Jethro's daughters immediately identify him as an Egyptian based on his appearance and mannerisms. Moses becomes a cultural chameleon, never fully belonging to the world he was born into or the one in which he was raised. His journey is not about concealing his identity but discovering where his true identity lies. Both stories also explore the power of anonymity. Odysseus famously calls himself nobody when trapped in the cave of the Cyclops. The clever deception allows him to blind the monster and escape because, when the Cyclops cries out that nobody is attacking him, the other Cyclopes dismiss his cries and offer no help. For Odysseus, surrendering his name is a calculated act of survival. Moses, however, attempts to hide from his identity for an entirely different reason. Standing before the burning bush, he recoils from God's command to confront Pharaoh. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" he asks, questioning not only his abilities but his very worthiness. Unlike Odysseus, who temporarily sets aside his identity to accomplish his mission, Moses initially resists the identity he is being called to embrace. In both narratives, the decisive turning point comes through divine intervention. Athena literally controls Odysseus' appearance, transforming him from weathered beggar to glorious king whenever the moment demands. His identity can be concealed or revealed by the goddess's will, making disguise a sacred instrument of destiny. Moses experiences an even deeper transformation, not of appearance, but of purpose. At the burning bush, he asks God for his name, and receives the profound reply, I am Whoiam. In learning the divine name, Moses discovers his own calling. The fearful fugitive who fled Egypt becomes the chosen representative of Yahweh, empowered not by his own confidence but by the authority of the one who sends him. For Odysseus, family is the destination. Every hardship he endures across 20 years of war and wandering is driven by one goal: returning to his wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus. Even when offered immortality by the goddess Calypso, he chooses the uncertain path home instead. His greatest triumph is not defeating monsters or outsmarting enemies, but restoring his household and reclaiming his place as husband, father, and king. For Moses, family is the foundation of his identity and calling. His life begins with the courage of his own family. His mother, Jochebed, hides him from Pharaoh's decree, while his sister, Miriam, watches over him as he is placed among the reeds of the Nile. Though raised in Pharaoh's palace, Moses eventually returns to stand with his biological family and lead his extended family, the entire nation of Israel, out of slavery. His mission is not merely political, it is deeply personal. Women and family are not simply supporting characters in the stories of Odysseus and Moses, they are the emotional center of each narrative. They provide purpose, protection, encouragement, and, at times, the greatest challenges each man must overcome. While the heroes are remembered for their journeys, those journeys are shaped at every stage by the women and families surrounding them. Throughout both narratives, women repeatedly become the heroes behind the hero. Odysseus survives because women intervene at critical moments. Athena serves as his divine protector, guiding his decisions and shielding him from danger. After he is shipwrecked, Princess Nausicaa offers him clothing, food, and safe passage, while the sea goddess Ino saves him from drowning by giving him a magical veil. Again and again, women preserve the life of the man destined to complete his journey. The story of Moses depends just as heavily on courageous women. Hebrew midwives refuse Pharaoh's command to kill newborn Hebrew boys, choosing obedience to God over obedience to the king. Pharaoh's own daughter rescues the infant Moses from the Nile and raises him within the royal household. Years later, during Moses' return to Egypt, his wife Zipporah acts decisively to save his life during a mysterious divine encounter by performing the circumcision of their son. At every major turning point, women become instruments of God's preservation. Yet women also introduce some of the greatest trials each leader faces. In the Odyssey, Odysseus' journey home is repeatedly delayed by powerful women. Calypso keeps him captive on her island for 7 years, offering comfort, pleasure, and even immortality if he remains with her. Earlier, the enchantress Circe transforms his men into pigs before eventually becoming his lover and delaying his voyage for another year. These episodes test Odysseus' resolve, forcing him to choose between temporary comfort and his lifelong purpose. Moses' greatest conflicts involving women come not through temptation but through family division. His own siblings, Miriam and Aaron, openly challenge his authority, criticizing both his leadership and his marriage to a Cushite woman. Their rebellion becomes a crisis for the entire nation, requiring God's direct intervention and resulting in Miriam's temporary punishment with leprosy. Moses learns that even those closest to him can become obstacles to the mission he has been given. The wives of each hero also reveal two very different portraits of faithfulness. Penelope is an active partner in Odysseus' struggle, even while separated by hundreds of miles. For 20 years she wages her own quiet battle against the suitors who seek to replace her husband, using intelligence and patience, most famously by weaving and secretly unraveling a funeral shroud to delay remarriage. Her faithfulness mirrors Odysseus' perseverance, making their reunion the emotional climax of the epic. Zipporah's role is quieter but equally significant. She shares Moses' years of exile in Midian, building a family with him long before he accepts God's call at the burning bush. As the confrontation with Pharaoh unfolds and the dangers intensify, she and their children are sent back to her father, Jethro, for safety. From that point forward, Moses carries the immense burden of leading Israel largely without his wife beside him, emphasizing the lonely weight of prophetic leadership. Taken together, these stories reveal that neither Odysseus nor Moses succeeds alone. Family gives each man his purpose, while the women in their lives become protectors, companions, counselors, and, at times, sources of conflict. Their influence is woven into every stage of the heroes' journeys, reminding us that even the greatest leaders are shaped not only by their own courage, but by their partners who sustain, challenge, and ultimately define them to be heroic in their own way. With the new film, The Odyssey is clearly introducing Homer's epic to a new generation. Modern audiences have a unique opportunity to look beyond the adventure and recognize its enduring themes that not only influence our feelings but our reality of still believing in Zeus, Hermes and Apollo, but calling them Moses, Jesus and Allah. The lessons do not require believing that a deity is controlling or monitoring our personal thoughts and actions. When the stories of Odysseus, Moses, and Jesus are examined side by side, the number of symbolic parallels invites deeper questions about the foundations of religious tradition. Themes of miraculous birth, divine guidance, exile, wilderness journeys, trials against overwhelming forces, sacrifice, transformation, and the struggle between human weakness and a higher calling appear repeatedly across these ancient narratives. The striking similarities in character, structure, and meaning make it impossible to ignore the influence of the broader Bronze Age and ancient Mediterranean storytelling world in which these traditions developed. When modern monotheistic religions are built upon stories that emerged from ancient cultures, languages, and mythological frameworks, understanding those origins becomes essential to questioning how these beliefs have shaped civilization, morality, and humanity's understanding of the divine. If we step back and examine the ancient foundations behind many modern religious ideas, a fascinating question emerges: what happens when we recognize that monotheistic traditions developed within a Bronze Age world shaped by mythology, oral storytelling, and evolving ideas about the divine? Perhaps the search for meaning does not require accepting every ancient story literally, but instead invites us to explore the deeper philosophical ideas that emerged from the same ancient cultures. One of the most influential examples comes from Socrates, who shifted the focus of spirituality away from external rituals and toward the inner life of the individual. For Socrates, the highest goal of human existence was not wealth, power, or social status. It was the cultivation of virtue, or arete. He believed that true morality came from knowledge, famously arguing that to genuinely understand what is good is to naturally choose what is good. In his view, wrongdoing was not the result of an inherently evil nature, but the consequence of ignorance. A person who truly understood justice, wisdom, and goodness would naturally pursue them. At the center of Socratic philosophy was the concept of the psyche, the soul. Unlike the modern idea of a soul simply as a spiritual identity after death, Socrates viewed the psyche as the deepest and most essential part of a person, the seat of reason, character, and moral awareness. The body was temporary, but the soul represented the part of humanity capable of pursuing truth and wisdom. For Socrates, the greatest responsibility of life was the continual care and improvement of the soul. As later expressed through Plato's writings, especially in Phaedo, the soul was understood as something that existed beyond the physical body and continued after death. Although Socrates never wrote his own teachings down, his students preserved and expanded his ideas. Through Plato and Xenophon, we gain insight into a philosopher who believed that human beings were guided not only by logic, but also by an inner connection to something greater than themselves. This idea is most famously represented by Socrates' daemonion, a mysterious divine sign or inner voice that guided him throughout his life. The Socratic daemonion was not understood as an evil spirit or supernatural possession. Instead, it functioned more like an internal moral compass. Socrates described it as a divine warning that would stop him from taking certain actions but rarely commanded him towards specific choices. It acted as a restraint, a voice telling him when he was moving in the wrong direction. He believed this guidance helped him avoid harmful decisions, including certain political actions that could have led him away from his philosophical mission. To modern audiences, the idea of a highly rational philosopher listening to an inner divine voice may seem contradictory. However, in ancient Greece, reason and divine inspiration were not viewed as opposites. The daemonion represented a belief that the gods could communicate with humans through intuition, conscience, and moments of inner awareness. Socrates' philosophy created a bridge between external religion and internal spirituality, suggesting that the most important sacred space was not a temple or an altar, but the human soul itself. In a world where ancient myths shaped the foundations of later religious traditions, Socrates offered a different path, a search for truth through self-examination, wisdom, and the improvement of the inner self. His ideas would profoundly influence Plato, later philosophers, and eventually the development of Western concepts of morality, the soul, and humanity's relationship with the divine.